Widowed mother of 15 was being evicted. A rich rancher bought her farm and married her the same day. The sheriff's wagon was already in the yard when I rode up. I hadn't planned to stop. The Alderman Road runs past the Voss place on the way to my south pasture, and I'd been out since before light checking fence line after the storm. I wasn't looking for trouble. Wasn't looking for anything, really. I just saw the wagon and the deputy tying something to the post, and I pulled my horse up without deciding to. There were children everywhere. That's what I remember first. Not her, not the deputy, not the papers tacked to the door, the children. Lined up along the porch rail, the little ones sitting with their feet dangling, the older ones standing with their arms crossed, all of them watching the deputy the way you watch something you can't stop but won't look away from either. I counted later. 15. Ages running from maybe 17 down to what couldn't have been more than 2, sitting in the dirt with a corn-husked doll and no real understanding of what was happening, which was maybe a mercy. She was standing in the middle of the yard. Ruth Voss, I knew her by name only, had seen her at the Dillard's store once, 2 winters back, loading a wagon with her oldest boy. Harlan Voss had died the previous spring, kicked by a mule of all the senseless things. Left her with the farm, the children, a note at Haverson's bank, and about 4 months until the note came due. She was not a small woman, not tall either, but she had a way of standing that took up space. Her hair was dark going gray at the temples, pinned back hard, and she was wearing an apron she hadn't thought to take off, and her jaw was set like something bolted shut. The deputy was reading from a paper, and she was listening without moving, without expression, and I could see in the stillness of her that she had already been through the crying and the bargaining, and had come out the other side into something harder. I sat on my horse and watched for a minute. The deputy finished reading, told her she had until sundown. Told her like he was apologizing and couldn't help it, which I suppose he was and couldn't. She said, "I understand," in a voice that gave nothing away. Then she turned and looked at the children and said something low to the oldest girl, who went inside. I don't know what made me do it. That's the honest answer. I'd been by myself for 11 years, built the Double R from a dry creek claim and 40 head of cattle into the biggest spread in Colfax County, and done it alone by hand, by stubbornness, and I had stopped somewhere along the way expecting anything from the world except what I could pull out of it myself. I wasn't a hard man, I don't think, but I was a closed one. Plenty of people had tried to tell me that. My sister. A woman in Cimarron I almost married once, a long time ago. I got down off my horse. The deputy looked at me. I said, "Frank, give me an hour." Frank Dooley had known me 20 years. He looked at the paper in his hand and then back at me and said, "Walt, I don't have the authority to." "An hour," I said. "I'll be back before noon." I rode to town. Haverson's bank was on the main street across from the feed store. Cyrus Haverson was behind his desk eating a biscuit when I came in. He was a small man with a large opinion of himself, which I had always found mildly interesting, the way you find a yapping dog interesting, not threatening, just present. I told him I wanted to buy the Voss note. He said the property was being foreclosed and was not for sale. I told him I wasn't asking about the property, I was asking about the note, the debt. The paper itself. He said that wasn't how it worked. I said I had an account at his bank with $47,000 in it, and if he'd like to keep it there, he was going to tell me what Ruth Voss owed, and I was going to pay it, and he was going to sign whatever needed signing. He chewed his biscuit. He said it was $412. I paid it. I had him write up a full release of lien and a quitclaim on any bank interest in the property. Took about 20 minutes. He wasn't happy, but he wasn't stupid either. A man with $47,000 finds another bank if the first one annoys him. I rode back. Frank Dooley's wagon was still there. He was sitting on the seat with his hat off, wiping his forehead, looking like a man who'd been told to wait and wasn't sure for what. She was still in the yard. She'd sent the children inside. I could see faces at the windows, a row of them along the front of the house like the most solemn greeting party you've ever seen. I got down, walked to her, handed her the release. She read it, took her time. When she looked up, her eyes were dry, but there was something working behind them. She said, "What is this?" I said, "Your farm." She said, "What do you want for it?" I told her nothing. It was hers. The note was gone and the bank had no claim, and she could do whatever she pleased with the property from here on out. She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Men don't do things for nothing." She didn't say it mean. She said it the way you state a fact you learn the hard way and intend not to forget. I thought about that. I said, "I've got 6,000 acres and no one to leave it to, and I haven't eaten a meal with another person at the table in 3 years. I don't know that I want anything from you, Mrs. Voss, but I'd be lying if I told you there was nothing in it for me." She looked at me for a long time. I'm not a man who fidgets. I stood still and let her look. She said, "You're Walter Kane." I said I was. She said, "I've heard of you." I said most of what people heard was probably true, and some of it was probably worse, and she could take that however she liked. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, something more careful than that. She said, "I have 15 children, Mr. Kane." I said I'd noticed. She said, "The oldest is 17. The youngest is not yet walking." I said I'd noticed that too. She looked back down at the paper and then at the house and then at me. She said, "What exactly are you proposing?" I said I didn't know that I was proposing anything. I said I thought she deserved to keep her farm, and I had the means to see it happen, and there wasn't a reason in the world not to. I said I lived alone on a large piece of land, and had more money than I knew what to do with, and had been, if I was honest, not entirely glad about either of those things for some time. And I said that if she ever found herself in a position where she thought she might want more help than a cleared note, she knew where the double R was. It wasn't a pretty speech. I'm not a pretty speech kind of man. She said, "You're asking me to marry you." I said I supposed I was, though I'd intended to work up to it more gradually. That one got a real expression out of her. Brief, genuine, something between a laugh and something sadder. Then it was gone and she was reading me again with those steady dark eyes. She said, "I don't know you." I said that was fair. She said, "I have 15 children." I said I'd heard. She said, "You'd be taking on 15 children." I said a man who couldn't handle 15 children probably wasn't worth much. She was quiet again. The wind came through and took some dust off the yard, and the faces at the window shifted and resettled, and somewhere in the house the 2-year-old started to cry, and then stopped. She said, "I'm not a woman who does things by half measures, Mr. Kane. If I say yes to this, I mean it. I'll be a proper wife to you, and I'll run your house, and I'll expect you to be a man of your word." I said that was exactly what I was offering. She looked down at the paper one more time. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket. She said, "All right." I turned to Frank Dooley, who had witnessed the entire exchange from his wagon seat with the expression of a man watching something he'd be telling people about for the rest of his life. I asked him if he knew where Judge Parham was likely to be on a Tuesday morning. He said the judge usually came into the courthouse around 10 and stayed through the noon hour. I looked at my watch. It was 9:42. She called the children out. There was a remarkable sound, the door opening and all that motion flooding into the yard, 15 people arranged by size like some kind of living staircase, the older ones looking worried, the younger ones just curious, all of them studying me with a frankness that would have been unsettling in an adult. The oldest girl, a serious-faced young woman with her mother's jaw, looked me up and down, and then looked at her mother, and some message passed between them that I wasn't meant to read. Ruth Voss, I suppose I should start calling her Ruth. She was going to be Ruth Kane by noon, turned and told them they were going to town. The 2 oldest boys went to hitch the wagon. 2 of the middle children started arguing about something and were silenced by a look. The little one in the dirt was scooped up by a girl of about 10 who carried her on a hip like she'd been doing it since she could walk. She came and stood beside me. We didn't touch yet. We were still strangers, more or less. But she stood at my shoulder and looked out at her children working and said quietly, not quite to me, "I've been afraid for a long time." I didn't say anything. I don't think she wanted me to. She said, "I've been afraid since before Harlan died, really. He was sick 2 years before the end. I've been carrying this on my own." I still didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not carrying it alone anymore." It wasn't a question. It wasn't gratitude either. It was a statement of fact, the way she'd stated earlier that men don't do things for nothing, a thing she was deciding to believe, settling it like a stone. We went to town. Judge Parham was a man who had seen most things in 40 years of frontier law and was difficult to surprise, but he looked at us over the rims of his glasses with an expression of genuine interest. He said, "Walt, what brings you in?" I told him. He looked at Ruth. He looked at the children who had arranged themselves in the corridor outside his office in a long, silent line. He said, "All of them." I said, "All of them?" He looked at me for a moment, not unkindly. He said, "You sure about this, Walt?" I said I was. He looked at Ruth. He said, "Mrs. Voss, this is your decision to make freely." She said, "I know whose decision it is, Judge." He found that satisfactory. He sent his clerk for the necessary papers. We stood in front of his desk, Ruth on my left, Judge Parham behind the desk, Frank Dooley, who had followed us in and was standing at the back trying to look like he wasn't there, and through the open door the 15 children watching with varying degrees of comprehension, and the 2-year-old, who had fallen asleep on her sister's shoulder. The judge read the words. Ruth said her part, I said mine. When it was done, the judge signed his name and leaned back in his chair and said, "Walter Kane." "I'll be." I shook his hand, signed where I needed to sign. Ruth signed. We walked out into the corridor, and there they all were. The oldest girl, her name was Clara, I'd learned, looked at her mother and said very quietly, "Did you?" Ruth said, "I did." Clara looked at me. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's way of looking, that straight, unflinching red. She didn't say anything. She nodded once, deliberate. I had the sense I was being extended a probationary trust and that it would take considerable time and consistency to convert it into anything permanent. That was fine. I understood that. I would have thought less of her if she'd given it freely on the same morning. We went back to the Voss place, my wife and 15 children and I, and began the business of moving. I won't make that afternoon into something it wasn't. It was long and hot, and the children were underfoot, and 3 of them cried at some point for different reasons, and one of the older boys, a 17-year-old named Eli, spent the better part of 2 hours not looking at me, which I understood and didn't push. Ruth organized everyone with a precision that impressed me. She had a system, a way of directing each child to a specific task, and when someone didn't do it right, she corrected them once and didn't repeat herself, and they did it right. She ran that household like a general runs a campaign, quietly, without display. The authority so established it didn't need raising. We loaded 3 wagons. I rode alongside. My foreman, a man named Redondo who had been with me 8 years and thought he'd seen everything, came out to meet us when we came through the Double R gate. He looked at the wagons. He looked at the children. He looked at me. I said, "This is my wife, Ruth Kane, and her children. We'll be needing the east bunkhouse aired out and 2 of the storerooms cleared." Redondo said, "Yes, sir." His voice was perfectly level. He was a professional. He started giving instructions, and the ranch hands came out, and everyone worked, and the whole thing was accomplished by 4 in the afternoon. The smaller children were fed at the big table in the house. The older ones ate with the hands. My house, which had been quiet for 11 years, which had been so quiet I'd stopped hearing it, was not quiet anymore. I sat on the porch that evening after the little ones were in bed, and the older children were settling, and the ranch was going through its last sounds of the day, and I watched the dark come in from the east over my land. Ruth came out and sat down in the other chair. We were quiet for a while. She said, "It's a fine ranch." I said I'd worked hard enough on it. She said, "I know what you did today. I know what it cost you." I said it was $412. She said, "I don't mean the money." I thought about that. She was right, of course. She was a perceptive woman, and she'd understood something I hadn't said and probably couldn't have, that walking up to a stranger in a yard and handing her money and upending the quiet of 11 years had cost something that had nothing to do with dollars. It was the place I'd been holding, a position I'd maintained. The man who didn't need anything, didn't ask for anything, built everything alone. I'd given that up in the 10 minutes it took to ride to Haverson's and back. I wasn't sorry. She reached over and put her hand on my arm, just that. Her hand on my forearm where I was resting it on the arm of the chair. Her hand was work-cruffined and warm, and it just rested there, not gripping, not performing. She said, "You're a good man, Walter Kane." I didn't say anything. I was not in the habit of receiving that particular verdict, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I sat with it for a while. She took her hand back. We watched the dark. After a while she said, "Eli will come around." I said I wasn't worried about Eli. She said, "He's protective." I said he should be. His mother was worth protecting. She turned and looked at me. In the last of the light, her face was still, that same still quality she'd had in the yard when the deputy was reading to her, but softer now. Something had let go behind her eyes. She said, my husband was not a bad man. He was a man who tried hard and fell short and knew it. I spent a long time propping him up. I didn't answer. She said, I'm not saying that to dishonor him. I said I knew she wasn't. She said, I'm saying it because I want you to know I understand the difference between a man you carry and a man who carries you. She went inside then, said she was going to check on the young ones. I stayed on the porch. I have sat on that porch most evenings of my life, and I have watched the stars come out over my land, and it has always been, to whatever degree I was willing to admit it, a lonely thing. The land is beautiful, and the stars out here are thick enough to touch, and there's a satisfaction to looking out over something you built. But a satisfaction is not the same as a warmth. It's not the same as another person in the chair beside you. That night, it was a different thing entirely. 3 weeks passed. I know people expected it to go wrong. We were strangers. I was a set-in-my-ways bachelor with a ranch to run and no practice with children, and she was a widow with 15 of them and her own way of doing everything. That's a recipe for friction, according to the general opinion of Colfax County, which offered it freely and without being asked. What those people didn't account for was Ruth. She ran the house. That was simple. She reorganized my kitchen in the second week, and I didn't object because the way she reorganized it was better than the way it had been. She set a table 3 times a day, and all 15 children sat at it, or at the overflow table in the hallway that a redondo built out of old timber, and there was noise and chaos and spilled milk, and she managed it all with a calm that suggested she had a deeper well of patience than anyone I'd ever met. My hands adored her inside of a week. She had a way with people, a directness that wasn't hard, and she learned names fast and remembered details. Who had a bad knee, who was superstitious about what, who needed a word of acknowledgement before they'd buckle down to work. She started riding out with me on the 3rd Saturday. Just to see the land, she said. I showed her the south pasture and the creek claim where I'd started. I showed her the ridge that caught the first light in the morning and the dry draw where we lost 20 head in the drought of '81. She asked good questions, not the questions of someone performing interest, but real questions, the kind that showed she was working out the math of a cattle operation in her head, calculating costs and margins, seeing the land not just as landscape, but as livelihood. I said, you know ranching. She said, I grew up on one, before my father sold it. I said, Voss's farm was a wheat operation. She said, I know, Harlan didn't want cattle. I thought he was wrong, but I was young and I didn't push hard enough. She said it without bitterness, just noted it, filed it. I said, you can be as involved as you want here, or not. Your choice. She looked at me the way she did, that reading look, and said, I think you mean that. I said I did. She said, then yes, I want to learn it properly. Eli was the last to come around. It took the better part of 2 months. I didn't force it. I didn't try to be his father, didn't pretend to be his friend, didn't attempt to manufacture common ground. I treated him like a young man who was capable and knew his own mind, which he was. I gave him real work, not make work, not something designed to flatter him, but the actual work of the ranch that needed doing, and when he did it right, I said so, and when he did it wrong, I told him plainly and without heat what he'd done and what to do instead. One afternoon in September, he came and found me mending a stretch of fence on the north line, the far end of the property, a couple miles from the house. He helped without being asked. We worked alongside each other for about an hour. Then he said, she looks different. I said, what's that? He said, my mother, she looks different than she did before. I kept working, didn't look at him. He said, she laughed yesterday. At something Clara said, she didn't used to laugh much. I pulled the wire tight and twisted it off. He said, I just wanted to say. He stopped, started again. I just wanted to say that I see it, what you did and what you're doing, I see it. I put down my pliers and looked at him. He was a good-looking kid, serious-faced, broad across the shoulders already. He met my eyes without flinching. I said, your mother is one of the finest people I've ever met. He held my gaze for a moment, nodded. We went back to the fence. That was all, but some things don't require more words than that. The winter came in hard and early. 3 feet of snow by November and the temperature dropping to things the old-timers said they hadn't seen in 20 years, and we were all in the house together, 23 people if you counted the 4 hands who boarded through the winter. And it should have been impossible, and sometimes it was close to it, and it was never what I'd call easy, but it was alive in a way the Double R had not been in 11 years. There was noise in every room. Boots stacked in the front hall, wet from the snow, someone always tracking something in, the smell of large amounts of cooking, children's voices at all hours of the day. I had come to understand that silence is only a virtue if you have company to come back to. Ruth and I developed the habit of rising early before the children were up. She'd start the stove and I'd do the first light checks, the stock and the water and the temperature reading, and when I came back in she'd have coffee made and we'd sit at the kitchen table in the dark before anyone else was awake and just talk. Or not talk. Both. We talked about the ranch, about money, about plans, about what we wanted the place to be in 10 years. We talked about the children, their natures, their needs, the things she worried about. She talked about her girlhood on the ranch in New Mexico, her father, the land there. I told her about my own father, who had been a difficult man but an honest one, and the way he'd died, and what I'd taken from it. She was the first person I'd told that to in a very long time. One morning in December, the coldest snap of the year, I came in from the barn to find her at the stove with her back to me, and she turned around with 2 cups and the steam coming off them, and she was wearing my flannel shirt over her dress, the one I'd left on the peg by the door. She hadn't done that before. She looked at me and said, "I hope you don't mind." And I said I didn't, and she handed me the coffee and her fingers were warm from the cup. I pulled the shirt collar up around her neck, just straightened it, a small thing. She looked at me from inside the flannel, and her eyes were soft and close. She said, very quiet, "I didn't expect this." I said, "What's that?" She said, "Any of this, being here, being this glad." I understood. I hadn't expected it either. I'd done a practical thing for a woman in a bad spot, and what had come back was something I hadn't been looking for and couldn't have named if I'd tried, the particular rightness of a person in your house. A specific person, her way of doing things, her voice at the end of the day. I put my hand against her face. Her cheek was warm. I said I'd do it again. She put her hand over mine and held it there. By spring things had shifted from being a new arrangement to simply being how things were. The Double R was a different place, louder, more complicated, harder in some ways and immeasurably easier in others. I had a woman beside me who was smart and capable and honest, who told me when she thought I was wrong and was usually right when she did, who worked as hard as anyone on the property and expected the same in return. I had 15 children ranging from a grown young man who was becoming a real hand on the ranch to a little girl who had recently decided she would ride a horse by summer and was prosecuting that goal with a ferocity that reminded me exactly of her mother. Clara remained watchful. That was her nature. She wasn't unfriendly, but she was careful, and she kept her own counsel, and I think she watched me for the better part of a year before she made any final judgments. One afternoon in April, she came and found me in the barn and sat on a hay bale and watched me work and eventually said, "Mama's happy." I said I was glad to hear it. She said, "I mean really happy. I haven't seen her really happy since I was a little girl." I kept working. She said, "I'm glad she has someone who's enough." She seemed to search for the right word and come back to that one. Enough. Someone who's actually enough for her. I thought about that word for a long time afterward. I had spent most of my adult life being enough for my land, enough for my operation, enough for my creditors and my contracts and the various practical demands of building a working ranch. I had never much thought about being enough for a person. I didn't know if I was or not. I knew I was trying. I think trying might be the main thing. I think Ruth knew I was trying, and I think she knew what it cost me to try, what it required of a man who'd been closed for a very long time to open up even the distance I had. She never pushed. She let me come to things at my own pace, and she was there when I got there, and that steadiness was, I don't have a better word for it. It was what I'd been missing for 11 years without knowing it had a name. One evening in May, the spring fully arrived, the pasture green and the air warm for the first time in months. We put the little ones to bed, and the older children were out on the porch, and Ruth and I took a walk out toward the south pasture the way we'd started doing, just the 2 of us, in the last of the evening light. We walked along the fence line where I'd started, the old creek claim. I told her the story of this stretch of ground, and she remembered it, asked about details I hadn't expected her to retain. We stopped at the corner post, original timber, 30 years old, still solid. I'd set that post with my own hands. I remember the day. I was 24 years old and flat broke and convinced I was going to build something here or die trying. I'd driven that post with 30 years of the rest of my life ahead of me and had no idea what any of it would look like. I looked at it now and thought, you couldn't have told me this. Ruth was looking out at the land, the grass moving in the wind, the sky going pink to the west. She said, "It's a beautiful piece of ground, Walt." I said, "It is." She turned to me. In that light, her face was the most straightforward thing, just her face, looking at me, no distance in it. She said, "I want you to know something." I said, "All right." She said, "I didn't say yes to you on that road because I was desperate. I want you to know that. I was frightened, yes, but I'd been frightened before and I'd kept going. I said yes because I looked at you and I thought, this is a man." She said it plain, didn't dress it up. "This is a man who stood between my children and the worst thing that could happen to them and didn't ask what he'd get for it. This is a man who says what he means and means what he says and doesn't need anyone to tell him he's right." She paused. "I've known men my whole life. I know the difference. I said yes to you because you were worth saying yes to." I stood with that for a moment. There are things that come at you across 60-some-odd years of living that you're not prepared for. Things that find the place in you that you've kept locked and get in anyway. I was not a man who cried. I had not cried in a long time. I didn't cry then. But I put my arms around her and she stepped in close and put her head against my chest, and I held her in the last of that evening light, out on the corner of the land where I'd started, the wind moving through the grass, the ranch behind us, 15 children and a life I couldn't have imagined back there waiting. I held on. That's all I know how to tell you. I held on and she held back. The stars came out the way they do out here, slow at first and then all at once, and my land lay out around us in every direction, and it was mine the same as it had always been mine, except it wasn't the same at all. A thing can be yours for a long time and still only become what it was meant to be when there's someone to be yours alongside you. I know that now. I knew it then, standing at that corner post in the dark, Ruth warm against my chest. We stood there a while before we walked back.